Hello and welcome to the HistoryNetwork.org podcast. If you'd like to become a patron of the podcast, just pop along to Patreon, that's patreon.com/the History Network, and you can find out all about it there. Thank you to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. The HistoryNetwork.org podcast, season 31. Episode 9, Lord Dunmore's War. This episode was written by Doug Nipple. As any regulars of you will know, Doug has written for us before, and he is a high school physics teacher who lives a few miles outside Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Growing up in one of the major areas of early American history, it was only a matter of time before he became obsessively interested in it. Thank you for the script, Doug. At the end of the 7 Years' War, the Proclamation of 1763 was issued by the British, which granted any lands west of the Appalachian Mountains in the Ohio Valley of North America to the Native Americans. American colonists could not settle any of these lands, and would be forcibly removed by British forces if necessary. Only 5 years later, the Treaty of Fort Stanwix was signed in what is now Rome, New York, between a group of 6 Native American tribes called the Iroquois Confederacy and the American colonists. This treaty undid the British Proclamation of 1763, and the Native Americans lost the lands to the south and west of the Ohio River on the western side of the Appalachians. As a result, colonists and settlers began to move into the previously inaccessible territories. Not all of the members of the Iroquois Confederacy backed the Stanwix Treaty. By 1773, the Shawnee and Mingo tribes in Ohio began to force the colonists out of what they considered their hunting grounds. Daniel Boone, who would later gain fame as a Revolutionary War hero and explorer, brought a group of settlers into the disputed area in 1773. Not long after this, a band of Shawnees attacked, tortured, and killed some of the settlers who had left the main group for supplies. Those killed included Boone's teenage son. The violence of this act led Boone to withdraw his group from the area and abandon the idea of settlement. News of this attack became widespread in the greater colonies and is often seen as the first event in what would become Lord Dunmore's War. The Shawnee would continue this psychological style warfare, kidnapping, torturing and killing of groups of colonists who would attempt to settle in the region. A letter from 1774 exists that was written to George Washington from a land surveyor working at the borders of the native lands. At this stage in his life, Washington held a position within the colonial Virginia government responsible for construction and maintenance of frontier forts. The letter to him outlines the general fear and apprehension along the frontier of the probability and frequency of native raids. It was apparent that the situation was about to reach a boiling point. Virginia's governor at this time was John Murray, Lord Dunmore. Dunmore was a Scottish lord whose family had run afoul of the crown, and his land inheritance in England had no appreciable income. Thanks to a fortunate political connection in his wife's family, he was able to procure the governorship of the colony of New York and move to America. This was a relatively lucrative position, with the added bonus that the governor could sell land grants and pocket the proceeds. As Dunmore was starting to make a nice profit from his position, the governor of Virginia died, and the Crown appointed him to fill that post. As Dunmore, under protest, relocated and was settling into his new position, he saw the monetary benefits of extending Virginian influence and territory further into the Ohio Valley. George Washington, among many other Virginians, had similar plans as the governor. In 1774, Captain Michael Cresap, under the authority of Dunmore, had begun settling into the native areas that were now being claimed by Virginia. Along with Cresap, two other major groups from Virginia were also moving into native territory. Ebenezer Zane commanded the second group of colonists settling nearby Cresap. George Rogers Clark was the leader of the larger third group that was forming up to travel down the Ohio River to settle in the Kentucky area. Clark, who would later become an influential general in the American Revolution, was troubled as he and his expedition sat near a river convergence, awaiting another group of settlers joining their party. Rumours began to reach the Clark party that natives, mostly made up of the Shawnee tribe, were actively ambushing and killing settlers that were moving down the river from them. The group under Clark had little military experience, but they knew Cresap was close by and had a martial background. Clark and his party met with Cresap concerning the situation. Many were pushing for an attack on the Shawnee, but Cresap advocated patience. He told the group that they were so numerous they would easily win an initial confrontation, but their actions would begin a larger war, and he was not willing to accept the blame. On Cresap's advice, all of the groups of settlers moved back upriver to the town of Zanesburg, which became the present city of Wheeling, West Virginia, for a few weeks to see if the situation would calm down. As the settlers arrived in Zanesburg, they found the population on edge because even more stories of Shawnee hostility and brutality were making their way upriver. To make matters worse, colonists and settlers from further out on the frontier were coming into Zanesville for safety with even more tales of savagery. Messages went back and forth between Cresap and the closest military authority, John Connolly, the commander of Fort Pitt. Connolly assessed the situation by sending out scouts and messengers and feeling the pulse of the local natives in regard to hostilities. His conclusion, based on the information brought back to him, was that war was imminent. He sent a communication back to Cresap in Zanesville explaining that hostilities were most likely to occur soon. Cresap, upon receipt of Connolly's letter, called a meeting and war was promptly declared by the group. The day after the declaration of war, Cresap's men spotted some natives in their canoes across the river from their camp and gave chase. There was a small battle at the location where Pipe Creek meets the Ohio River, with light casualties on both sides. This might not have been a big enough spark to start the conflagration of an all-out conflict, but the next incident was. Yellow Creek was a small offshoot of the Ohio River located a few dozen miles south of Pittsburgh. A group of natives, led by John Petty, who was the brother of the Mingo chief Logan, were peacefully visiting a trading cabin on Yellow Creek when a group of settlers, led by Daniel Greathouse, arrived. Both groups were drinking and apparently getting along, but Greathouse had planned treachery. The settlers suggested a shooting contest and gave the Mingo the honour of shooting first. When the Mingo warriors had all discharged their muskets, the settlers opened fire on them. Those who survived the first volley were tomahawked or knifed. The settlers even killed the native women and children that accompanied them. None of the Mingo party survived. The Mingo chief Logan was incensed and urged vengeance attacks. The Shawnee leader Cornstalk advocated patience and negotiation. Logan would not accept any talk of peace and took a group of warriors into the Ohio Valley and attacked any group of settlers he could find, swearing that he would take 10 lives for every one of his family that was killed at Yellow Creek. Not only was Logan killing settlers, he was visiting neighbouring tribes and inciting them to join him in his uprising. As Logan continued to inflame the natives and slaughter settlers, Dunmore declared a state of war against the Mingo, and the Virginia militia was activated. This was a power play on Dunmore's part on many levels. The year was 1774, and there were those in the colonies advocating separation from the British. In fact, Dunmore had to recently dissolve the Virginia House of Burgess on several occasions because the members were expressing sympathy with and wanting to show solidarity to New Englanders after the Boston Tea Party and subsequent British blockade of their harbour. By destroying the natives and ending this uprising quickly, he could raise his personal and political standing with the Virginia Burgess members. Not only this, but Dunmore had managed to invest and obtain land in the Ohio Valley. By driving the Mingo and Shawnee out, the land that he and other Virginians claimed became safer and more valuable. Dunmore called the Virginia militia to service. They were separated into two groups. The force directly under Dunmore gathered around Fort Pitt, present-day Pittsburgh, while Dunmore stayed at Fort Pitt, which he thought prudent to rename Fort Dunmore. He ordered the second group of over 1,000 men under Colonel Andrew Lewis to move down the Ohio River. Lewis was under orders to establish a camp at Point Pleasant, where the Kanawha River flows into the Ohio, and wait for Dunmore to join them at that point. There they would begin to attack Shawnee villages and push them out of the Ohio Valley. As Lewis and his 1,000 men moved towards their destination, they were stealthily followed by Shawnee and Mingo scouts who reported this incursion on their lands back to their chief, Cornstalk. Cornstalk was hesitant to engage the colonists and settlers, but with the arrival of Lewis's column in his territory, he gathered hundreds of warriors and moved to meet them. On the 10th of October 1744, a few of the colonists in Lewis's command had woken early to hunt deer for the column. They were promptly ambushed by the Shawnee, who had set up a trap that the militia would run directly into as they came to the rescue of the hunting party. Lewis, thinking the gunshots were a skirmish developing between his hunting party and some Shawnee who were just reconnoitring his position, sent two parallel columns of 100 men moving towards the sound of gunfire. Lewis placed his younger brother in command of the two columns. The columns moved directly into the Shawnee ambush, which poured fire from cover into the militia columns from both sides of the forest and their front. The younger Lewis was the first casualty, taking a musket ball to the chest. With shot coming at them from the sides and front, the leaderless men turned and fled back to the camp. The elder Lewis, back at the camp, now witnessed his two-column rescue party running towards him in a panic, carrying the body of his younger brother. After some initial chaos, he was able to organise an orderly retreat and form a firing line which halted the initial Shawnee thrust. Lewis had experience in backwards fighting, which informed him that the Shawnee would not usually attack a line of muskets and would always retreat if charged. The natives could not afford to take heavy casualties. All of the warriors from a village or tribe would be present in the attack. There were no reserves. Attacking a line of men or standing a charge would produce too many killed or wounded. The natives, in most cases, would fade back into the woods after an initial surprise attack. Knowing this, Lewis ordered his nearly 1,000-men force to charge the enemy. Under Cornstalk's leadership, the Shawnee retreated in an orderly fashion to high ground and formed a line under cover and returned fire. As day wore on, Lewis ordered several more uphill assaults on the Shawnee position, which were all rebuffed. Cornstalk knew that Dunmore was on his way with a larger force to relieve Lewis, and that he was running out of time, so he ordered his warriors to attack. The fighting was hand-to-hand and brutal, with neither side gaining an advantage, until George Matthews, a Virginian company commander, organised a flanking manoeuvre that destroyed the Shawnee line. Matthews would later go on to be a general in the American Revolution and the governor of Georgia. Cornstalk ordered a withdrawal, and the Shawnee retreated at dusk from the battlefield. The Virginia militia suffered more casualties, but held the field at the end of the day. The battle also robbed the Shawnee and Cornstalk of any momentum they could use to convince other tribes to join their fight against the Virginian encroachment of their land. Cornstalk later signed the Treaty of Camp Charlotte with Dunmore, giving up even more native land and promising to cease all attacks on settlers. The Mingo chief Logan was not present at the Battle of Point Pleasant and would not sign the peace treaty. Logan would send a message to the Camp Charlotte Council, which became known as Logan's Lament. In it he emphasised his earlier love of the British and Virginians, his betrayal at the massacre of his brother and family, and the necessity of his vengeance. His words were so powerful that they were printed in the colonial newspapers, and Thomas Jefferson included the text in its entirety in his only book, Notes on the State of Virginia. Logan would later die fighting for the British against the Americans in the Revolutionary War. The last line of his lament read, "Who is there to mourn for Logan? Not one." Well, thanks again, Doug, for writing that script for us. It's nice to have another one from you. And if any of you listening would like to write a script for us, just drop us a line, info@thehistorynetwork.org, and let us know your idea and we'll discuss it with you. Thanks again to all our patrons who make this podcast possible. Do pop along to patreon.com/thehistorynetwork if you'd like to become a patron as well. Thanks again for listening. You've been listening to the historynetwork.org podcast, written by Doug Nipple, read by Nick Barker.